This is part 2 of the video on restoring a really dirty Commodore 64. The bits I wanted to do, or that were remaining to do, was to create a new power supply. I've got a box of broken Commodore 64 power supplies, so I need to get one that's working and good. It seems that these things fail fairly often. And even if they're working at the moment, basically their life span is limited. Voltages tend to creep up on the DC, and eventually it tends to break the Commodore 64. So I wanted to build one based on fairly modern components and see if it was possible. And then the other thing that I wanted to do was fix that problem with the funny coloured the text that I was getting, where I was getting red characters as well. So first off, I broke into the old power supply. So as we saw in the last video, they coat it in like some sort of epoxy resin. It's completely gunked up in there, absolutely solid. All the parts are just in a really solid resin. And what I wanted to do is take the power cable and the cable that goes into the Commodore 64 and keep those and basically create new bits in the middle that generate the 9 volts AC and the 5 volts DC. So just cutting off as much as I can, digging out what I can and cutting off as long a piece of cable as I can. So this is the one that goes to the plug, and then I'm going to do the same with the one that goes to the Commodore 64 connector as well. Just the final pull, and it's free. Not a huge amount to play with, but workable. So next I turn my attention to the cable that goes to the Commodore 64. There's a bit more wire here to play with, so that makes it a little bit easier. These wires weren't buried in resin, so they came out really quickly. So the next challenge now is to take this resin block out of this case. I want to keep the case. I want to put my bits inside the original case if I can. So the idea is to just take it outside and smack it as hard as I can until the resin block falls out. And there you go, one empty case. It wasn't easy. A bit of persistence and a bit of encouragement, but in the end it was just a case of just keep tapping it until eventually the resin was freed from the case. So this here is the 9 volt AC transformer. It's rated at just over 2 amps I think, which should be more than fine for both a Commodore 64, and also the reason I went for this one is because I wanted this power supply to potentially power a VIC-20 as well, the newer style VIC-20 with the same connection as the Commodore 64. That draws a bit more power, so this one should be good for both. So 230 volts in and 9 volts out. You can just see there it's rated at 2.22 amps, so that should be good. And just trying it on for size now. So the idea is it's going to go inside. Just trying to work out what the best way to orientate this is. Could put it that way if I cut off those wings. I also want it to, I mean this, if you look at the case now, that's the top of the power supply generally. So I wanted it to sit quite nicely in there, so that when it was turned the right way around, it wasn't just going to sort of flop around and fall down. These things here, they flew off with some right force. But I'm just basically these little pins that were embedded in the resin, just trying to get a more flat surface. This was the power supply that I ordered from eBay. You can see the dimensions of it there. So looking at the dimensions, I thought this was going to fit quite nicely within the case. just needed to work out how best to orientate it. "5-volt module, also purchased from eBay. So the 9-volt one was just over £15, and this 5-volt module was about £5. And you can see it fits quite nicely inside the case. Good size really for this. It's rated at 2.5 amps at 5 volts. Now I'm just trying to work out where everything sits still, work out how the cables are going to come in and where everything's going to go. Once I had an idea in my head, it was time to start to wire things up. And this was the configuration that I ended up with. It was a good combination of having the 9-volt AC, which was really heavy, really solid, and I'd be able to lock it down quite well, and still left plenty of space for the 5-volt transformer as well. So first thing was to extend the cables, as the power cables are quite short that were coming in, so I wanted to run some new power cables to the 9-volt transformer. What I did is, again, as I said, I had a box of power supplies. I decided to use one of the other power supplies and take the mains cable out of there, so there's going to be no issues with worrying about thickness of cables or getting the right rating. So I'm just trimming off the ends, and then I'll wire these cables onto the 230-volt side of the transformer. Just tinning the connectors on the transformer, and now wiring on the two new cables that I've just cut. So these will connect to the original power cables coming into the box from the original plug. Just trying to get a nice solid connection, plenty of solder, plenty of flux. Now, I did make a mistake here, and we'll talk about it later on, but I need a 230 volt feed for the 5 volts, and what I should have done here is doubled up on the cables, but as I say, we'll see later on what I had to do. Next bit is to work out which wires coming off the C64 connector were what. So this was just a case of using a continuity test, holding the meter to one end of the wires, the wire that came into the power supply, and then touching the pins on the connector itself. I knew which pins were which. I knew there was a ground and a 5 volt, and then I knew which pins were the two ACs. So that one there is the ground, the very bottommost pin. So I worked out what colour wire that was, made a note of it for later reference. Then I made a note of which one was the 5 volts DC, and then the other two cables I knew were the AC, and polarity doesn't matter, so I didn't make a note of those. The main ones was to get the ground and the 5 volts DC. So the 5 volts DC is the pin on is next to the ground, and the AC are the two at the top, so 6 and 7 in the diagram. Out where all the or which all the wires were. The next step was to wire in two extension cables for the AC. You can see them, the black wires there. They went to the 9 volt side of the transformer, and now I'm just going to glue the transformer in. So just trying to get a load of hot glue on the bottom of the transformer, and I'm hoping that's going to hold it in place, and then I'll put some around the sides as well. So after I glued it in, it was at that point that I realised that I'd made a bit of a mistake. This is me just looking at a 3D printed bracket there for the 5 volt holder. But you can see what I've had to do is we've got the 230 volts coming in, and that goes to the 9 volt transformer. But I also need 230 volts to go to the 5 volt transformer as well. So what I did is I ran another wire. So I've got the 230 volts coming in, that goes to the 230 volt side of the transformer, and then there's another wire coming out of the 230 volt side of the transformer, and those wires are going to go into the mains input on the 5 volt transformer. I also took the opportunity to tidy the connections up a bit as well on the transformer, so you can see I've gone for some heat shrink when I've doubled up the cables. That's the red and the yellow heat shrink you can see. So they're just binding the two sort of 230 volt cables together, and just making a nice tight connection on the transformer itself. So the next bit to do is to wire the two 9 volt AC wires to the wires that connect through to the C64 connector. Just twisting the wires together, put a bit of heat shrink onto the cable, pushed out the way to start with, twist the wires together, and then solder the wires to form a nice solid connection, and then slip the heatsink over that connection, and then heat it up so the heat shrink shrinks and protects that joint. The next job is to add the extension wires for the 5 volt power supply. So these just push through the board, solder onto the other side, a bit of flux, and the solder holds it in place. Then just repeat it with the 230 volt cables. So these are the cables that are coming from the input on the transformer. Just push them through the board, a bit of flux, a bit more solder, and that's the 5 volt power supply sorted. Not much more to do now. The next bit is to take those 5 volt cables that are coming out of the 5 volt power supply and connect them up to the cables that are going to the C64 connector. So same as we've done before, put the heat shrink tube on first, twist the cables together, and then flux and solder to join the two cables, just using helping hands there to hold the cables in place while I solder them. Now we're just putting it all back together. So putting the 5 volt power supply into the 3D printed housing that I did for it. Just routing the cables around so there's no real strain on the cables, and they're fairly free of each other. Just trying to find the best route there. Making sure there's going to be space that I can close the bottom as well. And then testing the voltage. So the 5 volts, well, both voltages are a little bit high. The 5 volts was 5.5, which is higher than I wanted. And also the AC again was 13.33. This is all unloaded, and I was hoping they were going to come down as I did put load on them. There was no pot either on the 5 volt on this power supply, so there was no scope to adjust the 5 volts. Which, if I was doing this again, I think I would look for one where I could adjust it. Nice little blue light there when it's on from the 5 volt power supply. Not that you're going to see it in that case when it's finished, but it's the moment of truth. Will it work? Oh, there we go. The voltages were a little bit high. I was debating whether or not to try it with the voltages that high. They were probably just on the higher end of it being safe, but put a lot of effort into building this thing, so I wasn't just gonna turn around at this point. So I thought I'd check the voltages while it was running, see if they'd come down. The 5 volts, you can just see it I think on this, I was checking it on the user port, it's 5.35, so again still a little bit higher than what I would have liked. And the AC reading was 11.15, so that had come down a bit, as you would expect. The AC I wasn't that bothered about. The DC though, I would have liked that a bit closer to 5 volts. So yeah, definitely next time get one with a pot that I can adjust. I left it on for a bit and tested it for COVID, and the temperatures were good. It certainly runs a hell of a lot cooler than the original working power supply that I have. You can leave it plugged in for a long time and it just doesn't get hot at all. So I think the highest it went to was just under 30 degrees. The last job was to put the lid on it, or in this case the bottom on it. So I'm just gluing those cables in just to keep them from moving about, and then I'm going to super glue the case together. There's no, I couldn't think of an easy way to have it so that the bottom came off, and so I just went for super glue. And I also went for some more hot glue on the AC transformer. The reason for this is just in case if there was a little bit of a gap between the AC and the bottom, I didn't want it sort of moving about in there, so I wanted it bound nice and tight so it was locked in solid. And that's it, sealed up again, and hopefully should give me quite a few years of usage, I hope. So the last bit then is what about the original Hoover 64 that from part 1. So I've now got a power supply that I can use with it, but what about those red characters? Now when I did the test just now, when I switched on with the new power supply, I didn't use that C64. I used another one that I just got that was filthy and needed a good clean. So we're now back with the Hoover 64, and when I went to test this one with the new power supply, the red characters had disappeared. So I brought a spare C64 motherboard, as I mentioned in the last video, and the aim was going to be to replace it because I thought that one of the chips was faulty. But it turned out that I didn't need to do it. It was weirdly something to do with the power supply that I was using the last time. So yeah, as you can see, that machine now, it plays games, loads games, plays games fine, no issues at all. So this C64 is complete. All I'm going to do, I haven't videoed it, is I'm going to put some heat sinks on some of the chips. They do run hot, and hopefully that will just extend the lifetime of those chips a bit further. That's it. That's this machine finished.